I just want to jump on here this afternoon to talk about something Matt Chandler said in a recent sermon. This is from his most recent sermon, I do believe. It's titled, "Do Not Quench the Holy Ghost." And in this sermon, he started talking about politics. And he started making an argument about some research, probably from Docent, who knows, that a lot of churches, especially evangelical churches today, are, and he's right, are politically divided with other churches. And then he starts talking about how this is wrong and how churches and people are choosing churches based on their political ideology rather than their theology. Okay, so what I want to do is deconstruct what he's saying, and basically, obviously I disagree with it or I wouldn't be doing this podcast, but basically his argument is that, well, you can have Democrats and Republicans together in the same church so long as they agree theologically. And obviously that is rather absurd, because your theology should inform your politics. So I'll go ahead and start playing that now.
Flesh and behaving only in a human way. So we're starting to get, it hadn't landed yet, we're going to need a few more years. We're starting to get data in on what's happening post-COVID, even though it doesn't, I don't know what's about to happen, but I know what we're going to do. We're going to worship Jesus and gather, right? But anyway, the data's coming in, and here's what it looks like. It looks like if you pastor a church, a third of your people that were with you before, they're deeper in than they've ever been. They're more committed. They're giving more. They're serving more. They're like, these are my people. This is my church. Another third is like, I don't know. Maybe this is us. And then that other third is gone. Now, what we don't know about that last third is where they're going, because there were some other points in the research that's actually showing some really troubling things among evangelical Christians in the United States. And here's what's happening. That more than ever before, you can measure and see that people are starting to pick churches around their ideology, not their theology. In fact, on many points, we got people that are willing to join an ideological tribe, even as it flies in the face of their theology, which means we're not picking churches based on who's preaching the gospel faithfully, but whether or not they line up with our political ideology. Like this is math.
Okay. So here's the problem with that. The problem is that Matt Chandler is trying to separate one's ideology, whether it's political, sociological, whatever, from their theology. You cannot separate the two. If you are a Christian, if you are a believer, you are obligated to hold to the views that God has on these issues, be it political or sociological or financial or economic, whatever. God has laid out principles in his scriptures that we are to follow, that we are to obey. And see, here's the thing. Matt Chandler and David Platt and these kind of people are pushing this new movement that's stemming through this woke movement in the church and this postmodern ideology. They're pushing this movement that you can hold to certain political views in society, yet you can think differently about these things theologically. For example, and we'll just shoot straight, the Democrat Party. The problem here is progressives. What they're trying to do is make it so that Democrats and progressives, political progressives, can be comfortable sitting in church with conservatives, despite the fact that they disagree on things like abortion or homosexuality or whatever. And they justify it by saying, well, conservatives are for this. Therefore, they're pro-life. They're for... they're not pro-homosexual indoctrination in schools and that kind of things. And then they'll say, well, Democrats can still be against those things ideologically. But on the other hand, because the Democrats are pro-social justice for oppressed minorities or whatever kind of nonsense that they're making up these days, that kind of counterbalances that. So therefore we can make room for them because they believe in these things. They believe that it's a good thing that the Democrat Party is pushing things like reparations and social justice and critical race theory and these things like this that are actually, in their eyes, helping to offset the oppression and plight of non-white people, minorities, for example. All right, so here's the problem with that, and we're not going to get into how wrong it is to even believe that these kind of things exist. Anyways, I mean that's a whole different podcast, in which we actually did recently. You can check it out. What we're going to try to understand here is what Matt Chandler is doing in trying to justify basically sin. When you get to the root of it, it is sinful to consistently and repeatedly and unrepentantly vote for a party that's going to advance things like abortion and practically everything that God has laid out as against his moral nature and his law, his 10 commandments, is what the Democrat Party stands for. It really is. There's no way around that. And those who consistently vote to put people like this in office, there's no two ways about it. They are in sin. There's absolutely nothing redeemable about the Democrat Party. There's nothing that comes out of the Democrat Party that a Bible-believing Christian can stand for. Not even the social justice stuff. Not even if you believed that there was systemic injustice in this nation, what the Democrat Party advances to try to correct it is not biblical. It is actually just a reverse form of racist ideology. So we'll continue to listen to what he's saying here, and we'll talk about it some more.
Now, it's people that don't even know they shouldn't even admit that out loud. So, man, I'll go to this church. I mean, I don't think they really land where the scriptures land on this, but man, they feel the same way I do about these issues. Like, how are we supposed to stomp the devil under our feet if we just gather in ideological tribes? We're actually to show off Jesus Christ by gathering across ideological tribes. Like, have you ever thought, like, Jesus' disciples, it wasn't a great home group to put together? Have you ever thought about it?
Okay. We are actually to gather as Christians across ideological tribes. The problem with that is once you're a Christian, you don't belong to any other ideological tribe because your ideology is your theology. They are not separate issues. Your ideology, at least it should be, your ideology is your theology. Now, when we're talking about political parties, The Republican Party is an ideology. It's not Christianity. The Democrat Party is an ideology. It is not Christianity. I'll readily admit that. But here's the thing. With our theology that we get from these scriptures, from the Bible, things like thou shalt not kill, this is really the most obvious one. That comes from Scripture. And then we use our theology to inform our vote for any political party or candidate or whatever it is out there. Now, some people want to argue that, well, you know, the Republican Party's just as bad, and you know, maybe it's not as bad, but it's still, you know, headed in that direction, and maybe that's true. And in fact, I mean, it is true. And you know, some people may feel uncomfortable casting a vote for a Republican candidate because of something they believe in or something they stand for. And that's fine. I get that. And I'm not here to I'm not here to try to advance any political party or make an argument that the Republican Party is really the answer to our problem in America, because it's not. My main concern is teaching Christians how to think biblically about these issues. It's not that I don't care. I do care about America. I love America. It's historically been a great country, not without its flaws, for sure. But my number one concern is not seeing to it that the Republican Party wins the next election. All right? That's not my number one concern. My number one concern is people like Matt Chandler and David Platt teaching us that our ideology can be separated from our theology, and we don't necessarily have to think biblically about issues like homosexuality and abortion and feminism and government and education and whatever, you name it. And that's just, it's simply false. It's a lie. It's a lie that you can have Democrats and Republicans sitting in the same congregation together, and the Republicans believing that it's not okay to murder babies, and it's not okay to push sodomy in schools and march in Black Lives Matter anti-police protests. And then on the other hand, you have people who actually believe that these things are okay, or they're willing to even overlook things like abortion and homosexuality because they're just so for the Black Lives Matter stuff, and that we're supposed to be able to make room for all of those and come together under Jesus Christ. Well, Jesus Christ has an opinion about all of these issues. Jesus Christ has, believe it or not, an opinion about Black Lives Matter. And if you look into the scriptures, I guarantee you he's not going to agree with the Black Lives Matter movement. He's not going to agree with the ideology under that movement, because the ideology under that movement is not derived from biblical theology. That's the problem here. Matt Chandler is not teaching his congregation how to think biblically about issues like Black Lives Matter, and I know that Matt Chandler is pro-life, and I know that he's pro-traditional biblical marriage. That's not the issue here. But the issue here is that this woke movement has so grasped the church and people like Matt Chandler and David Platt that they're willing to compromise their own theology on this to advance this third way ideology. So what he's essentially doing here is exactly what he's preaching against. He's advancing an ideology, and this ideology is not biblical. It is unbiblical, and it is ungodly. And it must be rejected. So I don't want to take a whole lot of time. I just wanted to deconstruct that for a minute. There's a lot more in this sermon, and really the entire sermon wasn't about this. It was just a clip that was kind of thrown in there, and the whole sermon was really about, advancing charismaticism, which I also disagree with. And if you want to go back and listen to it, do it. But I'm going to end with that, and I hope you got something from it. And thanks for listening.